She didn't know the man standing in front of her was the owner of everything she thought she controlled. But when she smirked, rolled her eyes, and dismissed him like dirt, she triggered the collapse of an empire. Brick by brick, her arrogance would cost them everything. Stay with me, because this isn't just about one receptionist and one CEO. It's about what happens when power, prejudice, and pride collide, and how one silent man made sure they all paid the price. On a gray Thursday morning, as the rain slicked against glass towers and umbrellas blurred past revolving doors, a man named Elias Monroe stepped into the lobby of Vancroft Corporation. His suit was simple, impeccably tailored, but understated. His shoes polished but not flashy. His gait carried a quiet confidence, not the forced arrogance of someone trying to impress. He carried a single briefcase, black leather, worn at the corners, the kind of briefcase that didn't shout status but whispered history. His skin was deep brown, smooth and unbothered by time. His expression was calm, though his eyes were sharp, scanning every detail around him as if cataloging both the seen and unseen. The lobby itself was the kind of cold corporate beauty designed to intimidate. High ceilings, sharp marble floors, steel finishes that gleamed but offered no warmth. At the center sat the reception desk, white granite sprawling like an altar of authority. Behind it perched Cassandra Briggs, the longtime receptionist of Vancroft, a woman known in hushed employee whispers for her flawless appearance and sharper tongue. Today, as always, her blonde hair was sculpted into a perfect bun. Her nails gleamed with fresh lacquer, and her expression flickered between indifference and thinly veiled contempt. As Elias approached the desk, Cassandra's eyes flicked up from her monitor. Her gaze locked onto his face, then dropped. A swift assessment. Her lips twitched into something close to a smirk. She'd seen this type before, or so she thought. Delivery man, vendor, IT support, definitely not anyone important, her mind decided. His skin color alone, coupled with his unpretentious presence, confirmed it. Someone beneath her time. She didn't smile. She didn't ask how she could help. Instead, she sighed audibly, pulled her manicured fingers off the keyboard, and folded her arms with theatrical impatience. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone not inquisitive but dismissive. The kind of tone used when someone is already preparing to say, "You're in the wrong place." Elias nodded gently. His voice was even and deep, but soft. "I have an appointment on the top floor. 10 baje subah." Cassandra didn't hide the eyebrow raise. The top floor was executive territory, off limits to common foot traffic. Her fingers tapped against the desk. She didn't reach for the visitor log, nor did she ask for a name to check against the system. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A smile that women like her had perfected over years of dealing with unimportant people. "Sir, the maintenance entrance is around the side of the building," she said smoothly. "You can't use the executive elevators from here. I'm sure your delivery can be handled there." Her gaze deliberately dropped to his briefcase, assuming it contained tools, equipment, or perhaps sample goods. Elias blinked once. No frown, no reaction, just stillness, the kind of stillness that unsettles those expecting anger. But Cassandra mistook it for confusion. "I don't think you understand," he replied, his tone never wavering. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Another sigh from her, louder now, as though the conversation had already tested her patience far beyond its worth. She reached out, plucked a laminated security badge from a drawer, and slid it across the counter. "If you insist, you can wear this visitor tag, but don't expect to get very far. Security upstairs is tight. They don't entertain walk-ins." Her eyes briefly darted to her phone, thumb hovering, a silent threat that she was 1 second away from calling building security to escort him out. And then, in a flash of irritation dressed as condescension, she waved her hand dismissively toward the elevator bay without looking at him again. Whatever, good luck. Elias picked up the badge slowly, slipping it into the breast pocket of his suit. His fingers, steady and precise, also brushed the corner of his briefcase, where, if one looked closely enough, there was a small embossed metal plate. The letters were clean but subtle. Elias Monroe, CEO. But Cassandra Briggs did not look. She did not notice. Her gaze had already returned to her screen, her mind satisfied that she had put a man in his place. To her, this was routine, the casual dismissal of someone who didn't fit her narrow template of corporate significance. Behind Elias, employees bustled by, their eyes tired, their mouths silent. No one challenged Cassandra. No one questioned her assumptions. After all, this was how Vancroft worked. Appearances were everything. Gatekeeping was culture. And men like Elias Monroe, they didn't belong at the top of glass towers like these. But what Cassandra Briggs, in Vancroft Corporation, didn't know was that the man she just brushed aside wasn't here for a delivery or IT support or maintenance. He wasn't just visiting the top floor. He owned it. Every brick, every beam, every boardroom. And the quiet wheels of consequence had already started turning. In any organization, culture is not merely a byproduct of policies and procedures. It is a reflection of the countless interactions, behaviors, and attitudes that shape the everyday experience of employees and stakeholders. A company's culture dictates how people communicate, how power is distributed, and how success is defined. When this culture becomes toxic or exclusionary, the signs are often visible to an external observer long before they are acknowledged by those within the institution. Vancroft Corporation was a case study in precisely this kind of institutional blindness. While the leadership maintained an image of efficiency and high standards, the internal operations told a different story. To an astute observer, several patterns quickly emerge. The most obvious among these was the pervasive presence of microaggressions, subtle, often unintentional slights that conveyed dismissiveness, condescension, or exclusion. These could be seen in how employees from underrepresented backgrounds were interrupted more frequently in meetings, how their contributions were overlooked or credited to others, and how informal social gatherings consistently excluded them. Though individually small, these incidents accumulated over time to create an environment where certain employees felt undervalued and disempowered. Moreover, Vancroft's hiring practices revealed a deeper structural bias. Despite public commitments to diversity, the company consistently recruited from the same narrow set of universities and social networks, leading to homogeneity in both background and perspective. Job descriptions, ostensibly neutral, were laced with coded language that subtly discouraged applicants from non-traditional paths. Interview panels lacked diversity, which in turn perpetuated the cycle of like hiring like. Even when diverse candidates were hired, they rarely advanced beyond mid-level roles, creating a bottleneck that stifled both innovation and morale. Equally telling was the distribution of informal power. Key decisions were made not in formal boardrooms, but in exclusive social settings. Golf outings, private dinners, and elite gatherings, where access was restricted to a select few. This informal gatekeeping meant that strategic conversations and career-advancing opportunities were inaccessible to those outside the inner circle. Employees who challenged the status quo or advocated for equity were quietly marginalized, labeled as difficult or not a good cultural fit. As a result, dissent was stifled, and the leadership remained insulated from alternative perspectives that could have revitalized the company's strategy. Additionally, a pattern of performative inclusion was evident. Vancroft frequently showcased diversity initiatives in marketing materials, hosted surface-level workshops, and highlighted token successes to bolster its public image. However, these initiatives rarely translated into substantive change. Resources allocated to diversity programs were minimal, executive sponsorship was lacking, and metrics to track long-term progress were either absent or superficial. This gap between appearance and reality deepened cynicism among employees who recognized the difference between genuine inclusion and mere optics. The company's compensation and promotion structures further reinforced inequity. Performance evaluations, though nominally objective, were heavily influenced by subjective assessments of leadership potential and cultural alignment. These vague criteria disproportionately favored those who mirrored the existing leadership in style, demeanor, and values. Meanwhile, employees who brought different communication styles, problem-solving approaches, or cultural insights were undervalued, regardless of their measurable contributions. Over time, this created a self-reinforcing loop where only certain profiles ascended, further narrowing the lens through which leadership viewed the company and its future. Perhaps the most alarming indicator of Vancroft's cultural decay was the normalization of subtle exclusion. Many employees, particularly those from historically marginalized groups, had resigned themselves to limited career prospects. Coping mechanisms such as self-censorship, disengagement, and strategic silence were common. Talented individuals who might have driven transformative change chose instead to underperform deliberately or leave the company altogether, taking their skills and insights with them. Leadership, unaware or indifferent to these quiet departures, attributed attrition to personal factors rather than systemic failings. All of these patterns pointed to an organization that had ceased to learn or adapt. Its insular culture had created blind spots that undermined not only employee engagement, but also the company's ability to compete in a rapidly changing market. As newer, more agile competitors embraced inclusive leadership models and diverse talent pools, Vancroft's rigid hierarchy and cultural stagnation became strategic vulnerabilities. The significance of diagnosing these issues cannot be overstated. Without visibility into the real drivers of disengagement and exclusion, any attempts at reform would be superficial at best. Understanding the underlying power dynamics, unspoken norms, and institutional habits was essential to crafting interventions that went beyond cosmetic fixes. Recognizing microaggressions as indicators of deeper bias, identifying gatekeeping as a structural flaw, and exposing performative inclusion as a risk to credibility were critical steps toward genuine transformation. In this context, the silent observation of Vancroft's operations by an informed and deliberate outsider served as more than an academic exercise. It was a strategic assessment of vulnerabilities that leadership had chosen to ignore. Every microaggression witnessed, every biased practice identified, and every exclusionary pattern noted built a comprehensive picture of an organization out of sync with the demands of modern leadership and ethical governance. The quiet cataloging of these dysfunctions was not passive, it was preparatory. For an individual equipped with both the insight to diagnose and the means to act, such an understanding provided the foundation for decisive and irreversible change. What was being assembled, piece by piece, was not merely a critique, but a blueprint for dismantling an obsolete system and ushering in a new paradigm where competence, integrity, and inclusivity were no longer optional, but non-negotiable. In corporate systems that thrive on exclusion and hierarchy, the greatest disruption does not come from external competitors or hostile takeovers in the traditional sense. It comes from insiders who understand the architecture of those systems better than their architects do. When an individual possesses both intimate knowledge of a company's cultural weaknesses and the strategic leverage to act on that knowledge, they can shift not only the leadership structure, but the entire operational philosophy of the organization. Vancroft Corporation's reckoning stemmed precisely from such a convergence of insight and authority. Corporate mergers and acquisitions are often portrayed as purely financial maneuvers, driven by balance sheets, market positioning, and shareholder value. However, sophisticated acquirers understand that true competitive advantage lies in cultural capital. Acquiring a company is not merely about obtaining assets or customer bases. It is about gaining influence over how decisions are made, who makes them, and why. The quiet acquisition of Bancroft was not simply an opportunistic business transaction. It was a calculated intervention into an ecosystem that had long resisted meaningful change. The individual behind this acquisition had observed not just Bancroft's financial vulnerabilities, but, more crucially, its cultural liabilities, and recognized them as both weaknesses to exploit and opportunities to reform. Such strategic positioning is made possible by an understanding of positional invisibility. Power does not always announce itself with grand titles or conspicuous displays. Individuals who operate below the radar, free from the biases and preconceptions that typically accompany visible leadership, can move through organizations gathering insights, building alliances, and testing hypotheses without triggering defensive reactions. This silent accumulation of knowledge equips them with a rare combination of empirical evidence and emotional intelligence. An understanding not just of how the company works on paper, but how it actually functions in practice. In the case of Bancroft, the acquirer had been deliberately mapping the fault lines of influence long before the formal transaction was completed. He observed which departments were siloed, which decision-makers wielded disproportionate informal authority, and which employees represented untapped reservoirs of innovation and leadership. Just as importantly, he cataloged instances of bias, exclusion, and underestimation, recognizing these not merely as ethical failings, but as structural inefficiencies that hampered the company's long-term competitiveness. By the time ownership shifted, a comprehensive blueprint for transformation was already in place. This blueprint did not focus solely on surface-level changes, such as reshuffling management or issuing new mission statements. It targeted the deeper levers of power, revising succession pipelines to prioritize merit over cultural conformity, restructuring compensation to reward collaboration and innovation, and redesigning decision-making processes to amplify underrepresented voices. These shifts were designed not as symbolic gestures, but as systemic interventions that would permanently alter the company's operating DNA. Perhaps most importantly, the leverage for these reforms did not derive from conventional authority alone. Legal ownership and executive title were merely formalities. The true leverage stemmed from a deep, unassailable understanding of the company's internal realities, an understanding that made resistance futile. Leaders who might have contested the changes found themselves disarmed, not because they lacked positional power, but because their arguments crumbled under the weight of meticulously gathered evidence. Patterns of bias, inequity, and inefficiency were no longer anecdotal or subjective. They were documented, quantified, and indisputable. This asymmetry of information shifted the balance of power decisively. Where traditional change efforts often falter due to lack of clarity or competing narratives, this transformation unfolded with precision and speed. Long-standing gatekeepers who had relied on ambiguity and tradition to maintain control found themselves without refuge. Their influence eroded not through confrontation, but through obsolescence. New systems of accountability, transparency, and meritocracy rendered old power structures irrelevant. It is critical to note that such transformational leverage is rare, precisely because it requires a fusion of capabilities that are seldom found together. First, it demands strategic patience, the willingness to observe, listen, and understand without rushing to intervene. Second, it requires operational competence, the ability to navigate complex organizational systems and marshal resources effectively. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it calls for moral clarity, a steadfast commitment to principles of equity, fairness, and long-term value creation, even when expedience might suggest otherwise. When these elements converge, the result is not merely a change in leadership, but a fundamental redefinition of what the organization stands for. In Bancroft's case, this redefinition meant dismantling the unwritten rules that had long governed access to power. It meant elevating overlooked talent, diversifying strategic input, and aligning company values with the evolving expectations of global stakeholders. What had once been a closed, insular system transformed into an adaptive, inclusive, and competitive enterprise. This transformation also sent a signal far beyond the walls of Bancroft. To employees, it demonstrated that silent endurance of bias was no longer the only option, that structural change was possible and real. To competitors, it showcased the strategic advantages of inclusive leadership and cultural agility. And to the broader industry, it served as a case study in how legacy corporations could either evolve or be outmaneuvered by those who understood both the mechanics of power and the imperatives of justice. Ultimately, the true lesson of Bancroft's transformation was that power, when wielded with insight and integrity, is not merely about controlling resources, it is about reshaping possibilities. And those who underestimate individuals based on outdated assumptions about appearance, background, or status do so at their own peril. The leverage of quiet competence, when coupled with structural authority, is a force capable of dismantling even the most entrenched corporate empires. Organizational reform that is both credible and sustainable depends not on symbolic gestures, but on the deliberate establishment of accountability structures. Without clear consequences and systemic recalibration, even the most well-intentioned initiatives collapse under the weight of inertia and entrenched habits. At Bancroft Corporation, the inflection point came not merely with the acquisition of ownership, but with the precise and public exposure of the company's internal malpractices. The process of executing systemic accountability was not random nor impulsive. It was a calculated sequence designed to uproot dysfunction and embed principles of fairness and equity into the company's operational core. The first step in institutional accountability is transparency of misconduct. Without visibility into specific, documented patterns of abuse, exclusion, and malpractice, reform efforts tend to devolve into abstract platitudes. Bancroft's leadership was confronted with an exhaustive compilation of evidence, detailed reports outlining years of systemic racism, toxic managerial behavior, discriminatory practices, and inequitable treatment of employees. These reports were not anecdotal grievances, but meticulously gathered data, corroborated through interviews, internal audits, email correspondence, and statistical analyses of hiring, promotion, and compensation patterns. The evidence left no room for plausible deniability. By centering transparency, the reform strategy dismantled the defense mechanisms commonly used by entrenched leadership: ambiguity, gaslighting, and the minimization of employee experiences. When concrete evidence is presented with precision, those who benefit from the status quo lose the ability to discredit or undermine calls for justice. Furthermore, this transparency restored credibility to the voices of employees who had long been silenced or disregarded. In effect, the exposure of misconduct redistributed informational power away from gatekeepers and toward those advocating for change. The second critical step was enforcement of direct consequences. Far too often, corporate responses to cultural toxicity stop short of meaningful accountability, opting instead for voluntary resignations, reassignments, or vague commitments to future improvement. Vancroft's approach diverged sharply from this pattern. Top managers implicated in documented misconduct were terminated immediately and unequivocally. This included individuals who had wielded both formal authority and informal influence to perpetuate exclusionary practices. Terminations were not limited to overtly abusive figures. Even those who had enabled, ignored, or tacitly condoned the toxic culture were held accountable. The dismissal of the receptionist who had originally insulted the black CEO served as a symbolic but necessary reinforcement of this standard. While her actions were more visible and explicit than the subtle misbehaviors of senior executives, the principle was consistent. No level of the organizational hierarchy was immune to accountability. This clear, across-the-board enforcement of consequences signaled a decisive departure from the selective impunity that had previously governed the company. Third, systemic accountability required structural redesign, not merely personnel changes. Replacing individuals without addressing the underlying systems that enabled misconduct would have been insufficient. To that end, a full-scale corporate restructure was announced with three interlocking priorities: equity, diversity, and fair leadership. Equity demanded a recalibration of policies and processes to ensure that all employees, regardless of background, had equal access to opportunities and resources. His involved revising performance evaluation frameworks to eliminate subjective bias, instituting transparent criteria for promotions and compensation, and implementing robust grievance mechanisms that protected whistleblowers and ensured independent review of complaints. Diversity required a reimagining of the company's talent pipeline, from recruitment to executive leadership. Job descriptions were rewritten to be inclusive and accessible, hiring panels were diversified, and leadership development programs were designed to identify and elevate high-potential employees from historically underrepresented groups. Moreover, diversity metrics were embedded into executive performance evaluations to ensure sustained commitment rather than superficial compliance. Fair leadership emphasized behavioral expectations and accountability standards for those in positions of power. Managers were required to undergo intensive training on inclusive leadership, bias mitigation, and ethical decision-making. More importantly, leadership roles were redesigned to distribute power more equitably, reducing hierarchical bottlenecks and creating cross-functional teams where diverse perspectives were integral to strategy formulation and execution. These reforms were underpinned by institutionalized oversight mechanisms. An independent ethics and equity board was established, composed of internal employees and external experts, with the mandate to audit organizational practices, monitor progress, and intervene when necessary. Annual transparency reports were mandated, disclosing demographic data, promotion rates, pay equity statistics, and outcomes of misconduct investigations. These measures ensured that accountability was not a one-time event, but a continuous, embedded practice. Equally crucial was the cultural reframing of leadership legitimacy. Under the old regime, authority had been derived from tenure, social capital, and alignment with a narrow cultural archetype. Under the new paradigm, legitimacy stemmed from demonstrated competence, ethical integrity, and commitment to inclusive values. Leaders were expected to model behaviors that reinforced psychological safety, fostered collaboration across differences, and prioritized the long-term health of the organization over short-term personal gain. By executing systemic accountability through evidence-backed transparency, uncompromising consequences, structural reform, and ongoing oversight, Vancroft did more than merely punish wrongdoers. It reoriented the company's moral and operational compass. Employees who had long disengaged began to re-engage, recognizing that justice was no longer aspirational but actionable. Potential recruits and external partners recalibrated their perceptions of the company, seeing it as a progressive, forward-looking enterprise rather than a relic of exclusionary corporate tradition. This comprehensive accountability framework laid the foundation for sustainable cultural transformation. It demonstrated that meaningful reform is neither reactive nor cosmetic. It is systemic, intentional, and rooted in the courageous enforcement of values. In dismantling old hierarchies and embedding mechanisms of equity, Bancroft positioned itself not just for survival, but for ethical leadership in an evolving global market where inclusivity and justice are strategic imperatives, not optional ideals. True organizational transformation does not end with structural reforms or leadership changes. Rather, its durability is tested in the months and years that follow, when initial momentum subsides and the enterprise must prove whether its new foundations can sustain cultural and operational evolution. For Bancroft Corporation, the aftermath of its radical shift was not defined by temporary improvements, but by the emergence of a fundamentally different company, one whose success metrics extended beyond financial profitability to include ethical integrity, cultural inclusivity, and sustainable growth. This comprehensive recalibration created a business model not only resilient in the face of market pressures, but exemplary in setting new standards for corporate citizenship. One of the most visible manifestations of this transformation was in workforce composition and engagement. The deliberate redesign of recruitment, promotion, and retention systems bore fruit in the form of a workforce that was measurably more diverse, representative, and inclusive. Within months, hiring statistics reflected significant increases in candidates from historically marginalized communities across all levels of the organization, from entry-level analysts to senior executives. These hires were not token appointments designed to satisfy quotas. They were strategically selected based on merit and potential, nurtured by robust development programs, and empowered to shape the company's strategic direction. Crucially, employee engagement metrics saw an unprecedented rise. Anonymous surveys indicated substantial improvements in perceptions of psychological safety, fairness, and leadership accessibility. Attrition rates, particularly among underrepresented employees who had historically felt marginalized, declined sharply. This cultural shift also translated into higher productivity, innovation rates, and collaborative efficiency. Employees who felt seen, valued, and protected contributed more authentically and creatively, catalyzing a positive feedback loop where inclusivity directly enhanced business performance. From an external perspective, stakeholder relationships deepened and expanded. Clients, suppliers, investors, and community partners took notice of Bancroft's reformed identity. Investor confidence rose not merely because of ethical alignment, but because data increasingly shows that diverse, inclusive companies outperform their peers in long-term profitability and risk mitigation. Strategic partnerships blossomed with organizations that shared Bancroft's renewed values, positioning the company as a preferred collaborator in industries where ethical sourcing, fair labor practices, and social responsibility had become non-negotiable expectations. Additionally, corporate reputation underwent a dramatic rehabilitation. Prior to the transformation, Bancroft had quietly acquired a reputation for being insular, antiquated, and culturally stagnant, an image that had hindered its ability to attract top talent and progressive partners. Post-transformation, media outlets, industry analysts, and corporate watchdogs began citing Bancroft as a benchmark for inclusive reform. Awards for diversity leadership, ethical governance, and corporate responsibility accumulated, reinforcing a virtuous cycle that enhanced brand equity and customer loyalty. Financially, the company not only stabilized but thrived. Despite early skepticism from conservative stakeholders who fear that prioritizing equity and inclusivity might compromise profit margins, quarterly reports consistently exceeded projections. The combination of an energized workforce, diversified leadership, expanded markets, and strengthened stakeholder trust translated into robust revenue streams, improved customer retention, and reduced legal liabilities associated with workplace misconduct and discrimination claims. The business case for justice and inclusion was no longer theoretical, it was empirically validated. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the transformation was in leadership ethos and institutional memory. The old paradigms where power concentrated in narrow demographics and leadership legitimacy derived from exclusionary networks were replaced with a philosophy grounded in servant leadership, distributed authority, and ethical stewardship. Successors were chosen not merely for technical competence, but for demonstrated alignment with the company's values of fairness, humility, and long-term responsibility. Leadership training programs emphasized emotional intelligence, cultural competency, and systems thinking, ensuring that future decision-makers would not replicate the blind spots and biases of their predecessors. Institutional safeguards ensured continuity of the reforms. The Independent Ethics and Equity Board maintained its oversight role, reporting directly to shareholders and the broader public through transparent annual disclosures. Accountability mechanisms were embedded into strategic planning cycles, ensuring that inclusivity and ethics remained operational imperatives, not ancillary considerations. Employee resource groups flourished, fostering continuous dialogue between leadership and grassroots stakeholders to proactively identify emerging cultural challenges. Equally important was the symbolic narrative that emerged from Vancroft's journey. Internally and externally, the story of how an underestimated individual catalyzed the company's rebirth served as a lasting reminder of the dangers of bias and the transformative potential of inclusive leadership. This narrative permeated onboarding programs, leadership seminars, and corporate communications, ensuring that future generations of employees understood both the company's past failings and its hard-earned values. This legacy extended beyond Vancroft's own walls. Industry peers, observing the tangible benefits of Vancroft's overhaul, began to reconsider their own practices. The company became a thought leader in conferences, consortiums, and advisory boards focused on corporate responsibility and diversity governance. Vancroft's journey inspired similar transformations in adjacent firms, amplifying its impact beyond immediate market share and into systemic industry influence. Ultimately, the long-term aftermath of Vancroft's transformation proved a singular point. Organizations that confront their injustices head-on and embed equitable structures with precision and courage do not merely survive, they lead. The convergence of ethical integrity and strategic competence position Vancroft not just as a rehabilitated company, but as a blueprint for what modern corporate excellence must embody. Its success was not accidental nor temporary. It was the inevitable outcome of aligning power with justice and business with humanity. The story of Vancroft Corporation, while singular in its details, is emblematic of a broader truth that transcends industries, borders, and eras. It illustrates, in unequivocal terms, that power, when wielded with conscience, clarity, and courage, can dismantle systems of exclusion and replace them with architectures of justice. The arc of Vancroft's transformation demonstrates that those dismissed, underestimated, or marginalized often possess not only untapped potential, but also the strategic foresight and moral compass required to reform failing institutions. It is a case study in how principled leadership can subvert entrenched hierarchies and architect legacies that outlast individual careers or corporate cycles. But this lesson is not confined to the boundaries of one company. The imperative extends outward, challenging every professional, leader, and organization to interrogate their own structures, behaviors, and blind spots. The Vancroft example urges vigilance against complacency, reminding stakeholders that exclusionary cultures do not erode overnight, and inclusive practices require constant reinforcement. It reinforces the necessity of embedding equity as a living practice, not a performative gesture, and demands that all individuals with access to power examine how that power is deployed daily, whether it perpetuates injustice or dismantles it. Furthermore, the narrative underscores a crucial cultural reminder. Never underestimate those who operate quietly, those who observe rather than dominate, and those whose presence is often ignored in favor of louder, more ostentatious figures. In the modern economy, leadership is increasingly defined not by volume or visibility, but by integrity, empathy, and the capacity to enact systemic change. This understanding redefines who is seen as capable, who is given space at decision-making tables, and who is trusted with shaping future institutions. As audiences absorb this account, a shared responsibility emerges to disseminate these lessons, to advocate for similar reforms in their spheres of influence, and to challenge outdated perceptions of leadership and competence. Spreading awareness of such transformational journeys contributes to a wider cultural shift where ethical leadership is both expected and celebrated. If the principles outlined here resonate, if you believe power should be exercised for justice rather than ego, for inclusion rather than exclusion, and for transformation rather than preservation of unjust norms, it is imperative to share this story. By amplifying examples of successful, principled reform, we contribute to a collective memory that informs future organizational evolution and prevents regression into toxic patterns. Let this account be more than a passive observation. Let it serve as both a blueprint and a call to action. Engage with others, initiate conversations about accountability and equity in your networks, and use this example to catalyze reflection and reform wherever systemic barriers persist. And finally, if you found value in this story and wish to continue exploring narratives where resilience confronts injustice and silent strength reshapes systems, consider subscribing and joining this growing community. Together, through shared stories and shared action, we can remind the world of a fundamental truth. Never underestimate the quiet ones.